Well, welcome to the Wilkerson College Lodge Symposium. My name is Ben Sorenson. I teach history at Brunswick Community College, Cape Fear Community College, and Ashford University Online. And I'm going to talk about Freemasonry in the colonial period, especially from a viewpoint in North Carolina. And some of you, many of you, have already heard a version of this lecture. The first question we have to look at whenever we're trying to decide what effect did Freemasonry have in North Carolina, the first question we have to come up with is, well, what is Freemasonry? That's always a great question. Have you ever been asked, what is Freemasonry? How do you answer it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you answer it, Ben?
I say it's a system of learning to understand yourself and your relationship with yourself and your relationship with your God.
I like it. So why should I join?
For a deeper understanding of there's rich and thick things in life.
I love this answer. That's probably the best answer I've ever heard. That's actually a far better answer than what we give our first degree candidates. If you think back, what do we say? Freemasonry is a system of morality, veiled in a beautiful system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols.
What does that mean?
Right, what's that mean? Well, it's really hard to define it. I think you've given the best definition I've heard yet. Welcome. There are many things that we have to understand about Freemasonry at this time. Freemasonry, while it is a society of friends and brothers, that sacred band, if you will, it also, in the British mindset, has a very civilization type of aspect to it. Freemasonry travels with British civilization. That's always really important to understand. Freemasonry, in the British mindset, and remember, we're talking about the British mindset because, well, the colonists were from Great Britain. It brings with it civilization. In fact, the one Indian who becomes an officer in the British Army also became a Freemason as he became white or British. He became a Freemason. In fact, it was one of those things that had to happen. So Freemasonry follows with that idea of British civilization. Now, in 1735, as we move over to North Carolina, North Carolina was really a backwoods all the way through. You had the Cape Fear region, sparsely populated. The Moore's brothers, Maurice and Roger Moore, had just forced out the Indians from the New Hanover, Brunswick County area, and they had a plot of land handed to them by the king. These people were very rich. In fact, Roger is considered King Roger Moore, and the Moore family in Wilmington is still called the family. It's lasted since 1723, gives you an idea of what kind of money and power we're talking about. Well, they had set up a little plot of land that became what we call today Brunswick Town. Has anyone ever been to Brunswick Town? You have. It's a wonderful place. It doesn't surprise me that you've been to Brunswick Town. Brunswick Town was really one of the first settlements. It is the largest port in North Carolina at its time. In fact, by 1776, it was actually exporting 86% of all naval stores for the British Empire. Now, it had a rival city set up by a brother of ours, Burrington, that was first New Carthage, then New Liverpool, then New Town, then Newton, and soon he named it for King William, Wilmington. It was the sister city. It was also the arch rival. Wilmington grows while Brunswick Town kind of falters away. But in 1735, Thomas Tinneth, the Viscount of Weymouth, is also Grand Master of Masons in England. And he discovers that there's a call for a charter. Now, he actually takes the charter And when he takes his charter, he is already on board a ship by 1734, reaching the shores in 1735. We know that he made this trip with a charter for a certain lodge called Solomon Lodge. Now, we always hear about Solomon Lodge as if it were some type of nebulous, legendary lodge that might or might not have existed. It's hard to say. We have no records. We do know that he came over with a charter for Solomon Lodge, and that was in 1735. So we do know that a Solomon Lodge on the banks of the Cape Fear is actually chartered. The Grand Master of Masons himself has traveled to the New World with that charter. Freemasonry is rampant in Boston. Boston, however, is very civilized. It has roads. It has paved roads. That's something that we're just now beginning to get in some areas of North Carolina. They had roads, they had lodges, and it was flourishing there by 1735. But here in North Carolina, 1735, we get this first lodge that we really know nothing about. Very little. Now, anytime you bring men into a room, you end up with politics. Is that? We probably have politics in here right now. You know, is anybody a classical liberal? Oh, okay. So, you know, see, politics, they show up. Anytime you bring 5 people into one room, you end up with politics. Well, in 1717, we have to go back a little bit. 4 lodges met at the Goose and Gridiron. And they, in not just creating a Grand Lodge in London, they also started to codify what Freemasonry is. Funny thing about religions, whenever you codify them, somebody's going to disagree with it. Freemasonry is not a religion, but it is religious. And if you codify it, somebody is going to disagree with it. So when Anderson in 1729 prints his constitutions and everyone's looking at it and saying, oh, this is absolutely wonderful, there were some lodges in England and Scotland and Ireland and on the mainland of Europe who began to think, oh, no, this isn't how this should work. We shouldn't be dedicating to the Holy Saints John's, should we? Should we be dedicating to Solomon? What about Noahide Masonry, where the allegory of Noah's Ark plays a large role in it? Well, everyone has a question. Just like here, we have blue lodges, and we also have in Louisiana red lodges, if anyone's ever seen a red degree. These conflicting ideas, of course, lead to a schism. And that schism, it happens in 1751, when the ancients and the moderns, oddly enough, the ancients are the newer group. They have a newer form of Freemasonry that they say harkens back to the old. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Like Luther, Martin Luther, also wanted to go back to the old ways of Christianity. And Lutheranism is a very new religion compared to other types of religion like Orthodoxy or Catholicism, both of which have their roots in 313. But we can go to 1519 or 1521 to find the roots of Lutheranism. Same thing with Freemasonry. That split in 1751. You wouldn't think it has a lot to do with North Carolina. But if we look straight at Solomon Lodge, that lost lodge, we can see that it had a lot to do with it. Now, funny thing about Masonic history, we have to speculate more than other historians would like. Some people say if it's not written down, then we can't believe it. We actually have to take evidence, if we're doing Masonic history, analyze it, and come to conclusions, because very often the records are lost. But we can make very good educated guesses as historians. Very good educated guesses. So it doesn't seem out of the realm of the possibilities that Solomon Lodge, being a moderns lodge, following the constitutions like Anderson's constitutions, following the ritual of the 1717 Goose and Gridiron Grand Lodge of England, it would make sense because these were the rich and the powerful of England who had come to North Carolina, unlike the backcountry, which we'll see. These are personal representatives of the king. These are old money, very old money. These guys definitely have a pulse with the schisms in Freemasonry that are happening in England. And in 1754, we know that there is a request for dispensation. Let me take a look at exactly when I've got the dates on these. Yeah, so in 1754, there's a request for a dispensation. And that new lodge is called St. John's Lodge, under dispensation. Now, if the schism happens in 1751, and a boat trip can take between 6 to 9 months from England to America, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they would have heard about the schism and also been involved. And Solomon Lodge, being moderns, maybe these guys also wanted to, or a group of these guys wanted to go back to what they thought was old Freemasonry. So by 1754, they're requesting dispensation from the moderns, or from the ancients, to become St. John's Lodge under dispensation. 1755, they are chartered. And we have St. John's Lodge, which, by the way, is still in existence.
One or three?
One. Funny you should mention that. Now, I'm going to move to New Bern. I'm going to kind of move away from where I normally go. In New Bern, there is one document, and it is a cover page to a pamphlet that was for a lecture, and it is in 1754. And it is a Masonic lecture that was going to be given publicly by a brother in New Bern. Now, that proves that there was Freemasonry in New Bern before 1755. It absolutely does. Nowhere on it does it say which lodge was hosting it. Nowhere on it does it even say that there was a lodge. It's just there is a lecture on Freemasonry. So was it St. John's number 3? Was it a different lodge?
They think so.
They think so. Of course, they think it's St. John's number 3. With good reason, with very good reason. But we have them, I want to say their charter is 1771. I could be off on that. I'll have to look it up. I'm sorry, I'll have to look that one up. But their charter says 1770 something. And St. John's is definitely 1755. So in that realm, St. John's number 1 in Wilmington is actually before them. On the other hand, is there an older group of meeting Freemasons? Are they holding an older tradition in New Bern? I would not reject that possibility. Was it St. John's number 3? Who knows?
They're still mad about it.
They're still, yeah, I know. They're very mad at us about this. Now, when that dispensation, going back to 1735 up to 1754, when that dispensation then becomes a charter in 1754, and I've actually got a date. Let me double check myself here. Yes, paid for its charter, June 27th, 1754. St. John's paid for its charter, receives it in 1755. It is now a constituted Ancients' Lodge. That's kind of important for all of us. Because in Boston, right around 1771, there was a black man with 14 of his friends who were initiated into Freemasonry by a traveling military lodge in Boston. And we all know his name, Prince Hall. When you see Prince Hall, though, what is their letters after Prince Hall? PHA, Prince Hall affiliate. Yeah, and then they are what kind of Masons?
Oh, they're accepted.
F&M. They're free and accepted Masons, F&AMs or F&Ms. And we are AF&AM. We still hold that tradition from the schism here in North Carolina. We still carry the name. Even though we are under the United Grand Lodge, this unified Grand Lodge of England, we still carry the name Ancients. And in many ways, we can possibly thank St. John's, at least because we know that they paid in 1754 for their charter to become Ancients. That's why if you travel somewhere else, they become free and accepted, and then another place they become ancient, free and accepted. South Carolina is different. It's that ancient free Masons, something free and ancient, or they've got some strange, I can't remember the lettering. But we know that they had paid for that in 1754. Their number is 213. That should also give you an idea of how far back and how new Masonry was as a unified object at that time. If you look at Masonic lodges in England today, like there's a Internet Lodge. Are you a member of the Internet Lodge? No? You are. Okay, so you know my brother Charles Lewis, who was the past master of that lodge.
I know his name.
Right. Yeah, he was past master of that lodge as well as past Grand Master of all Masons in North Carolina. What's the number of that lodge? 1076. 1076. And there are more after it. St. John's was 213. Now, what's really interesting about St. John's, by 1813, they're struck from the rolls. So they get blacked out from the rolls of the United Grand Lodge of England. Anyone have an idea why?
What was the date?
1813?
We're in the Second War with Britain.
Yeah, we're in the War of 1812.
Madison's War.
Yeah, Mr. Madison's War, exactly. Yes, Mr. Madison's War got St. John's struck from the rolls. It tells you something about what they must have been doing. One of the people out of that was Blakely, the ship captain who was lost at sea during that war. But he was a member of St. John's. He also was quite the scourge to the British Navy while he was still alive at sea. That might be one of the reasons he gets knocked off the roll, that we get knocked off the rolls. Now, there was a Hanover Lodge, and it's somewhere around Wilmington. We don't know where it existed. We know it did exist. We think it's chartered somewhere around 1756 because the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts has it as being chartered May 13th, 1756. But what happened to it, we're not sure. It seems to have gone dark. There are no records other than the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts records. So just kind of reeling back a little bit, what we do know so far is that Solomon Lodge most likely existed. There was a charter for it. It was actually chartered at the same time as a Solomon Lodge in South Carolina, but only the one at the Cape Fear got put in the rolls by mistake in England. So that's even more proof that there was a Solomon Lodge, although Solomon Lodge still exists in South Carolina and is going strong. It looks like Solomon Lodge possibly changed to St. John's. which interestingly would make St. John's Lodge number 1 and all of Freemasonry in that case in North Carolina one of the oldest meeting fraternal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. Since we're all under the same Grand Lodge, that would make what we do every day in North Carolina part of one of the oldest meeting fraternal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. Now, there was another lodge, perhaps you've heard of it, Royal White Hart Lodge in Halifax. It's first organized in 1764, and it actually gets its dispensation to organize from somebody named Cornelius Harnett. Don't answer. Does anybody know Cornelius Harnett? Ever hear of him? You've heard the name? Yeah. Well, hopefully you'll know exactly who he is after this lecture. Cornelius Harnett. He was working for Joseph Montfort when Joseph Montfort became the Grand Master of all Masons of and for America. That's what it says on the charter that he received. Interesting note. What it says in the books in England is of and for North Carolina. Did somebody put North America on the charter by mistake and North Carolina correctly in the books? Or was it the opposite? Was he supposed to be Grand Master of and for North America? And they put it wrong in the book? It's one of the questions we will never know the answer to.
And this is the ancients.
Yes. These are all ancients at this point. White Hart Lodge, Royal White Hart Lodge is an ancient lodge. It's actually put together under the authority of Cornelius Harnett, who was distributing that authority from St. John's Lodge number 1. Not from the Grand Lodge of England, but he was acting as a district deputy Grand Master under William Montfort, or Joseph Montfort. Wow, William. On August 12, 1767, the lodge is chartered by John Salter, Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England. Its number is now 403. There's a lot of Masonic activity going on if you just do the math. 213 in 1755 to 1767, 403. Now, there's also a First Lodge in Pitt County. That's its actual name. First Lodge in Pitt County. That's what they called themselves. And we know it was chartered as early as 1766 by a Jeremy Gridley, Provincial Grand Master, Massachusetts, appointed in 1753 over parts of North America which were such official had not been appointed previously. That's his title. I'm appointed Grand Master over parts of America where there is no Grand Master, in modern terms. Now, there was Mr. Cooper, who was the worshipful master of that lodge. And according to a communication sent to the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, June 24th, 1767, we know that Royal White Hart is, or the First Lodge in Pitt County, I'm sorry, I jumped. First Lodge in Pitt County is actually working at that time because of these correspondences. Union Lodge number 8 in Fayetteville, we know it gets chartered by Scotland in 1760. Now, there's an interesting point to Union Lodge. Who lived in Cross Creek? At the time, it was Cross Creek. It wasn't Fayetteville. Well, many people had been coming to the Americas, especially into North Carolina. A bunch of Highland Scots who had lost the Battle of Culloden came over as they were running away from England because life was horrible for them after the Battle of Culloden. And they landed in Wilmington and Brunswick Town. And what did they see but a bunch of Englishmen? So they picked up their bags and they moved inland. And they went to a place called Cross Creek. So of course, Union Lodge, chartered by Scotland, made up of Highland Scots. Now they'll become really, really important in just a second. As you can tell, we've got a lot of lodges that are popping up all over North Carolina, and this is indicative of what's happening all over the East Coast. Well, come 1765, a certain act had been passed through Parliament, and for a long time, the colonies had existed in a state of salutary neglect. Have you ever heard of that? It means that there are laws on the books, but because England respected the Americans, they didn't enforce those laws. There were taxes that needed to be paid, but we'll turn a blind eye. That period of salutary neglect. Now, when we get into the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which a 21-year-old lieutenant, major, he was a major. That's right, first rank. He was a major, thank you. He actually had, under the direction of Governor Dinwiddie, had been sent to a place that most people don't know about. It's a little town called Pittsburgh. At the time, it was one little fort. Now today, it's a huge city, Fort Duquesne. And he was supposed to tell the French to cease and desist with the fort and leave by Dinwiddie's orders. Well, when you know it, they end up having a small battle with some French, and he takes them captive. And their leader, a man named Jumonville, is brought in front of him, and the Indian ally of Washington, that we'll call the half-king, while Washington is corresponding with this man, gets angry and pulls out his tomahawk and yells something in French, which Washington doesn't speak. He takes his tomahawk, dives it right into the head of Jumonville, and dives his hands into the brains and washes his hands with Jumonville's brains, causing quite a stir. And the French, of course, get very upset. We end up having a big war in America called the French and Indian War. Because of this, it's George Washington's first act, to stand back and say, I don't know what I'm doing. He'll do that very often and seem to win. It's kind of interesting. Well, after that war, England needed to refill its coffers. So that period of salutary neglect comes to an abrupt end. And a certain tax called the stamp tax actually comes across the seas, passed by Parliament. We pick it up. And many places like Boston, New York City, they're very upset about the stamp tax. If you have playing cards, they're taxed. If you have a marriage license, it's taxed. A deed to the house, it's taxed. Everything must have the tax stamp affixed to it, proving that you paid the tax. If it's paper, it must be there. Well, of course, many people are very upset about this. In North Carolina, we have a talent of doing more than talk. And the same Cornelius Harnett, who was master of St. John's Lodge in 1765 to 1766, builds, and we're not sure how, but certainly through Masonic correspondence, he builds up a lot of support, many people talking. But in Wilmington and Brunswick Town, he actually pulls together a huge group that becomes his personal militia. He goes to William Tryon, the royal governor of North Carolina, who's living in Tryon's castle at the time. Russellboro is its actual name, and it's in Brunswick Town. So it's not in New Bern, it's in Brunswick Town. New Bern had him for 16 months. Brunswick Town had William Tryon for 5 years. Well, Cornelius Harnett goes to William Tryon and says, look, I offer you my personal protection. William Tryon, personal representative of the king, royal governor, says, I don't need your personal protection. And Cornelius Arnett says, as a brother, I'm offering you personal protection. Well, I don't need it. Fine. And he shows up a couple hours later, puts William Tryon under house arrest with an armed militia circling the house as they also forced the comptrollers to resign. Because of that one armed rebellion, the only armed rebellion against the stamp tax in the entire United States, happening in Brunswick Town and partially in Wilmington in 1766, in February of 1766, North Carolina becomes the only colony not to pay a single shilling in stamp tax. And it was from Cornelius Harnett. Now, Cornelius Harnett, remember, he's master of St. John's Lodge. He's also acting as a district deputy grand master under Montfort. Montfort's going to die in 1776. But Cornelius Harnett, he has a lot of power. He has a lot of clout in North Carolina, all through the East. He's very rich, very opulent, but he's also really an everyday person. He's that type of leader. He comes across as an everyday man, but if you look what's behind him, there's a lot of wealth and a lot of power. Well, as people are beginning to discuss what to do about England, and of course this takes a few years, up to 1775, when we have some shots fired in Concord and Lexington, many people are talking about reconciliation with the crown. How are we going to reconcile this? We, after all, are good British citizens. So how should we reconcile this? Cornelius Harnett, he's having none of that rhetoric. He is one of very few people, Thomas Paine, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry being a few, who are speaking of independence from Britain. And this is a radical, liberal idea, very Whiggish. He's the only one really speaking of it, but except he's building a lot of support through Masonic lodges. Now, come 1776, there is a battle at Moores Creek. The royal governor had changed from William Tryon to Josiah Martin. Josiah Martin actually loses control because of Cornelius Harnett, Richard Caswell, and Robert Howe. Richard Caswell, by the way, is the only person coming out of New Bern in this little group. The other two are from St. John's Lodge number 1. He loses power, and Cornelius Harnett begins to run a government, a provincial government in North Carolina. Josiah Martin is on board the Scorpion, which is a boat sailing up and down the Cape Fear. That's all he's got. He has sent his wife and children back home to safety, back to New York, and then back to England. He is trying to keep correspondence going. He's going to bring over Sir Peter Parker, who is a great naval captain. He wants to bring over Henry Clinton, who is a great general, and he wants to bring over a little-known Irish regiment general named Cornwallis to help him take back this colony. If we can take North Carolina, guys, we can take back all of America. Not the United States yet. Had to catch myself there. But we can take back all of America. And Parliament and the King, King George III, they look at it and say, absolutely, this is a great idea. And Josiah Martin says, can I be a lieutenant again? And the king says, absolutely not, you're incompetent. So poor Josiah Martin, he's stuck on a boat. He can't even get military orders, but he's got all of these great forces coming over from Massachusetts and Ireland to come help him take back the Cape Fear. So he sends word out to Cross Creek. Hey, we're back in Fayetteville. Union Lodge, chartered by Scotland. Well, guess who he invites to come help if they'll raise a militia to take back North Carolina? Highland Scots, who are very upset with people like Cornelius Harnett, Robert Howe, Alexander Lillington, and Richard Caswell, because they were all at the Battle of Alamance against the Highland Scots. So the Highland Scots say, absolutely, 250 free acres, and we get to defeat our old enemies again? Sure, we'll align with England for that. Forget the Battle of Culloden. We'll come back for that. This has nothing to do with politics out of Fayetteville. This is personal. Now, making a long story short, they do march. Another Mason, James Moore, from St. John's Lodge number 1, he becomes the general of the militias coming out of Wilmington. They do go to Cross Creek. They try to block off the advancement of these Highland Scots. It all culminates at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. And at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, if you wanted to wait as long as the battle took, we could sit here in silence for 3 minutes, and that's as long as the battle took. The Patriots won overwhelmingly. They lost one person, killing 70 of these Highland Scots that were coming in. When this happened, no Scots were able to meet Cornwallis, Clinton, and Peter Parker. They were very upset, and they abandoned Josiah Martin's ideas of trying to bring back North Carolina. Because of this movement, because of this organization, North Carolina becomes the bulwark to the South being taken over by the English. It just can't happen. And we actually hold it until 1780. Now, Cornwallis is not a stupid man. And in case you didn't know it, he's also a Freemason. And he takes one look as he starts his southern campaign and realizes that all the communications that are making his life horrible, that are letting Francis Marion know where he is, all these communications are moving through Masonic lodges. So when he begins his battles in the South, he's not just trying to take over the South. He is also systematically shutting down every lodge he comes across. He also declares that only 2 Americans will not be given general pardons. Robert Howe, member of St. John's Lodge number 1, and who's now acting as a general for George Washington in the colonial army. Of course, we can't give him that because he's also good friends with Cornelius Harnett. Cornelius Harnett, one of the main reasons he is the thorn in Cornwallis' side, is right after the Battle of Moores Creek, Cornelius Harnett went to Halifax. And he wrote this little part that ends up in the minutes of this Committee of Safety in Halifax. And it's a short little piece that most people overlook. As he said, resolved that the delegates for this colony in the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the delegates of other colonies in declaring independency and for forming foreign alliances, reserving to this colony the sole and exclusive right of forming a constitution and laws for this colony, and of appointing delegates from time to time under the direction of a general representation thereof to meet the delegates of other colonies for such purposes as shall be hereafter pointed out. This gets sent to Philadelphia, to the Congress. We know it today as the Halifax Resolves. Cornelius Harnett had written this, presented it, had it passed. It is the first moment where an entire colony declares its independence from the crown. Of course, Cornelius Harnett is going to be the one person not given a general pardon. He just changed the entire dialogue of the Americas. Before it was reconciliation. He puts that out. It goes up to Philadelphia. And some little-known lawyer, right? You guys might have heard of him, Thomas Jefferson. He ends up using it as the blueprint for another document that I'm sure you guys have had to read a couple of times, called the Declaration of Independence. It really comes out of Cornelius Harnett, who was corresponding all this through his lodges. So when Cornwallis makes it to Wilmington, his first order of business is to shut down the lodge there. And he shuts down St. John's. He takes all the records. He takes the charter. We have no idea what happened to them. They might have been sent back to England. They might have caught on fire and burned, because very often archives burn. It's a very sad fact, but it happens all the time. His second order of business, after shutting down the lodge so that correspondences couldn't be made, was to find Cornelius Harnett, which he does, and throws him into a prison after beating him very badly, throwing him over the back of a donkey and parading him, as they say, like a sack of potatoes through Wilmington to show everybody what happened to this great leader, Cornelius Harnett. Well, as they realize, Cornelius Harnett is only 58 years old, but he's so badly beaten, his health begins to deteriorate in prison. So the British finally release him, and within 2 weeks, Cornelius Harnett is dead. Robert Howe is never caught. And that was in 1781. Now, all of this shows what Freemasonry was during the Revolutionary period in North Carolina. Take a look at time. I might soon have to take questions, I see. Is it 45 minutes?
We're going to take a break at 10, so you got 20 minutes altogether.
Oh, okay.
Questions fine. If you want to just talk for 20 minutes, that's fine.
Okay, great. Still trying to where I'm supposed to be. We see what this Freemasonry was in North Carolina during the Revolutionary period, especially with Cornelius Harnett. When he died, they shut down all the lodges. What we know after that is that St. John's Lodge doesn't show up again with records until 1788. And at that time, a good friend of his, Richard Caswell, is acting as the master of the lodge for its first meeting under dispensation. It's a rather exciting story to have in Wilmington. Now, the Sons of Liberty, they were also put together by Cornelius Harnett. He had his fingers in everything. And all the correspondences were heading through all the lodges. There was only one lodge that remained open in North Carolina after Cornwallis went through, and we think it's in Edenton. I have always wondered, and I want to see the records of Phoenix Lodge to see if they break, because the other lodge that should have stayed open would have been it. After all, they were helping Cornwallis. Now, going back to 1788, that person, good friend of Cornelius Harnett, good friend of Robert Howe, good friend of William Hooper, who's also a member of St. John's Lodge No. 1 and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I don't know if you guys know this, all three signers were Masons. We can document that in North Carolina. No other state can prove all of its signers were Freemasons except for us. We can prove that all three of ours were. This guy, this Richard Caswell, shows up, and he is acting as the interim master to start off St. John's Lodge No. 1, possibly as a favor to some very good old friends. Who is Richard Caswell? Now, Richard Caswell is quite an amazing personality as well. He actually comes down from Maryland, moves to a little place called Kingstown, soon to be called Kinston. He becomes a surveyor. He becomes, he becomes a prominent man in Kinston and soon moves to New Bern, where he begins to also accumulate power and wealth. He had a very forceful forceful personality. He was a mastermind of military genius. In fact, at the Battle of Moores Creek, it's Richard Caswell who brings his militia from New Bern all the way into Burgaw, and then just past Burgaw into Curry. He brings his militia in, and he takes on the Highland Scots in one place, moves back, sets up a camp, keeps fires going, puts his back to the water, keeps 200 people in that camp, and sends the rest of his forces across the river to combine with other forces on the other side of a river that you can reach only by a small footbridge. The idea was to bring all the Scots in on his camp to slow them down or to open fire and take them from the backside of the river. That's why he has his back to the river to entice them. Look where I am. I'm in the worst spot. Oh, my fires are still going. Well, he actually keeps the fires going. Then he hears the Scots coming. He moves out of camp, drops down, and joins the main militia, and we have the Battle of Moores Creek. Pure genius. In fact, another commander is going to do the same thing in the Revolutionary War. Do you know who that was?
Could be General Washington.
Yes, it would. And in fact, in correspondences back to Richard Caswell, one of the aides-de-camps writes to Caswell and says, in fact, General Washington has borrowed your tactic. Now, he's a member of a lodge in Kinston and St. John's No. 3. And he's using the lodges as well for his correspondence. It's an interesting life with him. He actually becomes an elected governor, and he gets elected more than any governor in North Carolina history. That's how much people loved him. He's the first elected governor. Richard Caswell was a real force of personality. When he died, all the lodges corresponded about his death. And St. John's has that correspondence still in the minutes. Now, we're going to jump, because he died in, 1789? 1789. We're going to jump forward a little bit. A certain aide-de-camp to Washington, his name is Benjamin Smith. He too is extremely wealthy. In 1800, we have him owning about 211 slaves. In 1810, 199. It's not because he lost any wealth, but people do get sick and die. And it seems that that's why the amount of his slaves dropped. He's extremely wealthy. He owns a huge plantation in today's Leland. Actually, it's a section of Leland that they call Navassa. And if anyone's ever been to Leland, there is a little shop called Piggly Wiggly. His house used to stand where the Piggly Wiggly in Leland is today. He is an extremely rich person, another force of personality. Everybody calls him the general in that area. And in fact, Southport was supposed to be Smithville because of Benjamin Smith. To give you an idea of what kind of person he was very upset about that name. He said, "This place is destined to fail, and you want to link my name to failure." Interesting guy. But he comes up with this idea as he's looking around, and he realizes that the penal code of North Carolina really needs to be revamped. He also realizes that there is not much in way of good higher education in North Carolina. This is a horrible, horrible situation to be in. We are, after all, the birthplace of America. Moores Creek is truly the birthplace of America. It's where the idea of independence actually was born, in North Carolina. We should have an institution that would match this. Well, a few other Masons at St. John's, they're talking to him about this. And of course, he's got the money and the land to donate to do it. And a man named William Richardson Davy is also there, very good friend of Washington. In fact, he's actually part of the XYZ affair. if you know what that was. Some delegates from America went to France to try to work out some new diplomacy for the nascent USA and France. And the French said, oh, no, you have to bribe us before we even let you through those doors. And we're not even sure they'll talk to you anyways. And so the three French officials become official X, official Y, and official Z, and it becomes a big, huge problem. In fact, we even have a quasi-war with France over it. One of the delegates in this, and also to patch it up, is none other than William Richardson Davie. He's also governor of North Carolina at one point. He is in this group with Ben Smith and these other Masons, all from New Bern all the way down into Wilmington, and they're discussing what to do about this problem. Well, they come up with a charter, and this charter, they decide, well, we should start building the school that we've chartered. So they go and say to Ben Smith and say, what can you donate? And he donates 20,000 acres, much of it in today's Tennessee. Tennessee used to be North Carolina. Well, William Richardson Davie goes to this place outside of Raleigh that has been donated to him, and he lays a cornerstone in what is now called Old East at UNC. There is a medallion in 1829 that the Grand Master wore when he rededicated the school. The medallion, the symbol on the medallion is a blazing sun. The symbol for UNC is the same blazing sun. All of this from some little lodge in 1735 on the Cape Fear banks. It's amazing to see how Freemasonry has added to North Carolina from the east. If you guys come back for the second lecture, we'll take a look at it from the west. Now, I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any.
Jonathan put a photo of that medallion on Facebook.
Oh, he did?
In the last 2 days. The Grandmaster's going to wear it today at the cornerstone rededication.
Oh.
He had
Now, is that not good timing?
He had a photo of the medallion, and then he had the UNC seal. Yeah.
Wow.
So you can compare.
Yeah, they're definitely the same. There's a good reason for that. Yeah. Also, the Latin, does anyone know, anybody here a UNC grad?
Well, I attended there for
You attended there. Okay, what's their motto?
Lux Libertas,
What's that mean?
light and liberty.
Light and liberty. I wonder where they would have gotten that. Siat lux et lux fuit. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. You've probably heard it as fiat lux. The original Latin translation was Siat lux et lux fuit. Lux et libertas. It's a very Masonic state.
So we've talked about Pitt County. We've talked about Royal White Hart,
Mm-hmm.
New Bern. Dobbs County
Dobbs County.
was in existence, which was green, and it split into other counties.
Yes.
Was similar Masonic activity in Dobbs County, or?
Dobbs is beginning to kind of be more of a backwoods. It's a very strange effect in North Carolina. On the east, you have all of these very rich, very prominent, very proud Britons. And then in the west, it's more of the poorer people. In fact, they are setting up Freemasonry for a very different reason. In the East, it's very much a prominent thing. Look how important I am. I'm a Freemason. The lodges there were extremely exclusive. They weren't at all the Masonic ideals that we have today. If you look at the roles, they are men of means, they are men of money, they are men of power. And very rarely do you find somebody in the rolls who's not in the East, especially at St. John's Lodge, number one. And some people would argue that St. John's Lodge still acts that way sometimes. But we'll strike that from the tape. No, I'm kidding. Some people would say that they act that way, especially in New Bern. Now I'm in trouble. They're from St. John's Lodge, number one. No, but it's true. Many people would say that we act that way. From other lodges. The reputation is still there. But in Dobbs County, it is very much this very egalitarian society. In fact, in that area, and we'll talk about it next time if you come back, the overwhelming experience in lodges mirrors the experience in religion. There are people that are trying to bring good Baptists and good Methodists under the fold in the backcountry of North Carolina, and even the preachers will say, and these people seem to just escape when I start talking. And very much this independent, almost like a Gnostic ideal of how to worship is very prevalent in the western part of the state. I would say from the Cape Fear west, it gets almost Gnostic in people's views of religion. And with that comes a completely different type of lodge. The lodges, they're being made, but it's because people are looking for a place to get away from their wives. They're looking for a place to congregate, to socialize, and they don't want it to be a church because, well, you've got the priest over there telling us we have to be holy. So let's have a Masonic lodge where we can worship God as we like and still come together and be friends. So Dobbs County actually has this different feel, this different vibe to its lodges. And in fact, the western part of the state, it's really hard to document exactly how lodges come up and how they work.
Let's
We'll
pick
wrap
up
it.
there in
Okay.
the second session. I think
Sure.
everybody's probably going to stay for the second session. And
Oh, wow.
Let's let them have a 5, stretch your legs.
Oh, absolutely.
So look, guys, let's try to be back in here in just 5, no more than 10 minutes.
Sounds good.
Fine job.
Thank you.
Wonderful job. Wonderful job.